Okay, I want to continue with my discussion of Plato. In the last video, I talked about the allegory of the cave and how the allegory of the cave presented in a story form. Plato's vision of reality is split into two: the world of sense perception, the world that we perceive with our eyes and ears, and so on. And the real world is up here, and what's really real, Plato says, are not the things that we perceive with our senses, but these eternal forms. So down here, in the world we live in, we see beautiful things. But up here is the form of beauty. And the form of beauty never changes. It's perfectly beautiful. Plato has a description of love. Plato believes that beautiful things are to be loved, but we shouldn't get obsessed with them. The beautiful things should be a way of moving beyond the temporal beautiful things to absolute beauty. If you get stuck on beautiful things in this world, then you're going to remain inside the cave. The world down here for Plato this is when you're in the cave. When you move beyond the shadows of the cave and behold the forms, then you've come out of the cave and you're in the world of reality. So Plato believes that when you love another person because they're beautiful, or you fall in love with someone who's beautiful, eventually, if you're loving in the right way, you will come to the point where you realize what you really love is the beauty, this eternal, timeless beauty. And then Plato thinks you should transcend, take your gaze away from this and focus on this. The same things for justice. We see many just actions. We see just things. That's just. Some things are unjust, but we do see just people. We see just actions, and we know they're just. But for Plato, if different things are just, they are only just because, in some sense, the word he uses is participate. They participate in the form of justice, which for Plato is real. Beauty is real. They're not simply ideas in our mind. They actually exist. We say many things are good, right? It's Martin Luther King. What he did was good. We talk about good actions, good people. This is good. That's good. Well, Plato wants to know, what are we talking about when we're talking about good? For Plato, there is the form of the good. And for Plato, the form of the good is actually the highest of all the forms. It's in the allegory of the cave, you have the sun, which is illuminating everything and brings life to everything. For Plato, the sun is an image of the form of the good. He says it's beyond being. Justice, beauty, equality, and so on. These things are, but the good is beyond being. And in some sense, it's not exactly. Plato's not very clear on this, but in some sense, the form of the good is very close to what many people mean by God. So anyway, this is the world that Plato believes is the world of reality. He also believes, and I mentioned last time in mathematics, he believes that there's a form of the circle. He believes that when we draw circles, as you will never see a circle it's impossible to see a circle. No one has ever seen a circle. We call them circles, but no one has ever seen a circle. It's impossible to draw a circle. Circles are perfectly round, and no one can draw something perfectly round. We've never seen triangles. We've never seen lines. Lines in mathematics, they have no width at all. And anything that anyone draws will have some type of width. So the circles, these mathematical entities, circles and triangles and points and lines, no one has ever seen them. And so you wonder, well, how do we know about circles if we've never seen a circle? how do we know about triangles if we've never seen a triangle? Plato would say these ideas are innate in our soul. They're not things that we can actually perceive, but we know that they exist. The mathematicians deal with these all the time, circles and triangles, and they don't exist, but they do exist in the world of forms. They exist. They're not things that we can perceive with our senses. They're things that we can know with our mind. And Plato believed, and many mathematicians, Nobel Prize winners in mathematics, many mathematicians are Platonists when it comes to mathematics. So, when people say, oh, Plato says what we see are shadows or images or copies of what's up here. Many mathematicians say that's perfectly true. The circles and the triangles and the lines that we have down here are images or copies, imperfect copies of the perfect circle, the perfect triangle. Plato has a dialogue, the Meno, in which a slave boy who knows no mathematics, geometry at all, just through the process of question and answer, is brought to prove a geometrical proof, I guess, from Euclid. He knew nothing about mathematics at all. And so just through questions and answers, that's what all Socrates did, just question people, about justice and courage and so on. But in the Meno, the slave boy is questioned about a geometrical problem. Let's say, I'm not sure if this is what Plato actually used, I can't remember, but it's the Pythagorean Theorem. A squared plus, with the right triangle, a squared plus b squared equals c squared. Imagine the slave boy who knows nothing about geometry, just through a process of questioning, is brought to prove the theorem that a squared plus b squared equals c squared. And the question then becomes, how is that possible? Because nobody taught him. He just simply asked questions. But after the sequence of questions, they were very, very simple questions, just things that he could intuitively see. At the end of those questions, he had actually proven a geometrical proof from Euclid. How is that possible? Nobody taught him. He just was asked questions. And Plato's answer to this is that the reason the slave boy could answer the questions correctly is that deep down in his soul, he already knew the answer. The knowledge was innate. It wasn't something that he learned. Nobody taught him. He simply asked questions. In his soul, he already knew the answer. The knowledge was innate. So Plato, so that's basically Plato had a doctrine of what's called the knowledge is recollection. The slave boy had to recollect what he already knew. Where did he know this? Plato says if his knowledge was not learned from perception or from experience, it was innate, surely what he knew, right, had to be innate. It had to come from somewhere beyond experience, and that's the realm of the forms. So the mathematical entities that the slave boy knew, in this case the triangle, the form of the triangle. That's why he knew it. The form of the triangle exists in the world of forms. The slave boy, Plato says, before his soul was born into his body, the soul existed in the world of forms. And in the world of forms, the slave boy saw the right triangle. And when he was born into his body, the soul came into his body, he forgot it. Plato believed that that's the case for everyone. We're all in the same situation. The way that we have access to the world of forms, Plato says, is not through sense perception. It's not through the body. It's through the soul or the mind. The soul or the mind is able to perceive true beauty, justice, goodness, the mathematical forms. Plato also believed that everything actually down here is a copy of what's here. So even a tree, when you see a tree down here, this is a tree and this is a tree. You see trees. Well, if A is a tree and B is a tree and C is a tree, you ask yourself the question, well, what is a tree? You can't say, well, that's tree, because they're all trees. So what is, they all, in a sense, participate in treeness, in the tree, the perfect tree, the form of the tree. So whenever you have, for Plato, when it's called the one over many argument, whenever you have two things that are A, let's say A, I'll say B, and you say is a tree, or is anything. So is a tree, I'll say tree. A is a tree, B is a tree. It's because they participate in the form of the tree. If A is a table and B is a table, it's because they participate in the form of the table. This is the problem in the Middle Ages, became very important as a problem of universals. What do we mean by these terms that refer to many things? What is a tree? Well, you can't say, what's treeness? You can't point to A, because what about B? So A is a tree and B is a tree because they participate in the form of the tree. And for Plato, the form of the tree is more real than the individual trees. Most people, the common sense switches it around and says the tree that we see, the individual tree, is more real than the universal concept. But for Plato, it's the opposite. For Plato, these abstract ideas are ultimately real. So when it comes to A is beautiful, B is beautiful, they are beautiful because they participate in the form of beauty. And the form of beauty is more real than beautiful things. Beautiful things can be beautiful because they participate, they share in the form of beauty. This is called the one over many argument. If you have many things, I'll just say two things here, many things, and you say is F, F will be, is the form. And it could be is a table, is a tree, is just, is beautiful. A is F and B is F. Because they participate in the form of F. So whenever you have several things that are something else, this is a table, that's a table, that's a table, it's because they participate in the form of the table. This is a circle, that's a circle, that's a circle, it's because they participate in the form of the circle. The form is what's ultimately real. Let me give you an example that might help. I mean, that's kind of hard to, people, it's hard to believe, it's hard to kind of grasp. But think of it this way. If I draw, let's say I'll draw this. So I ask you, how many A's are here on the whiteboard? How many A's? And you could say, well, there are 3 A's. Yeah, that's true. There are 3 A's. But in another sense, you can say there's only 1 A, because these are instances or tokens of the type. Philosophers often talk about token type. There's 1 A, actually. It's the type A, and these are tokens of the type. Tokens are things you can actually see. But the reason, how do you know that these are A's? The reason you know that there are 3 A's is because you have an idea in your mind of A. And that idea is not something I can draw. It's something you know with your mind. Whatever I draw on the blackboard is something you can perceive with your senses. But the concept A, you cannot see with your senses. That's kind of, a little way, might help to understand kind of what Plato is saying with the forms. The forms are more real than the instances that participate in than the things that we actually see. And the forms for Plato exist in a world, a timeless world, perfect world, changeless, and that's ultimate reality for Plato.